Well, we have a wonderful evening in store for you, but before we get started, we want to take a minute to thank the people who made this all possible. So first of all, I do want to mention everyone who's on the steering committee. So if you're here, actually, you can raise your hand when I mention you. Michael Cameron, Linda Carpino, Mavanwi Collins, Cindy Dadd, Bethany Groff-Doro, Allison Driscoll, Rena Espaillat, Sherry Frank, Elida Fry, Jessica Hilbin, Nana Kennedy, Karen Kruger, Alfred Nicole, Debbie Zabo, Sky Wentworth, and Glee Woodworth. So thank you. It takes a lot of people to put this festival together, so thank you, all of you. And we're not going to name everybody's name, but in addition to the steering committee, we have a lot of volunteers that help us out on the day of the festival. So thank you to everyone who volunteered today.
And in addition to the people who put everything together and help us organize it all and then help us execute it all, we have to acknowledge our sponsors, because if we didn't have any money, we wouldn't be here. And this is free to everybody to come, but it's not free to put on. So the 5-cent Savings Bank, the Newburyport 5-cent Savings Bank, the Institution for Savings, and a number of foundations also give us money. The two banks are the founding sponsors and our major sponsors, but we do get money from foundations. However, they like to fly under the radar, so we'll let them. But the Rotary Club also gives us money, so we'd like to thank all of those. And if you have a program, on the back of the program, you'll see the many friends who have donated money to keep us solvent, and we're grateful. I don't want to go to jail. Do you?
Thank you, everyone.
Yes, thank you. So we're so pleased tonight to honor Jean Doyle, because she really reflects the history of Newburyport. And I just want to say that, you know, with all the organizational things and all the financial support and all of those things in place and the beautiful physical geography of Newburyport, if it weren't for the spirit of Newburyport and the fact that they embrace this the way they do, there wouldn't be a festival. So, you know, congratulate yourselves as well. We're grateful, that's for sure. And it's so appropriate for us on our 10th anniversary to honor Jean. And now we want to bring Donna Holliday, Mayor Donna Holliday, out to read the proclamation of Jean Doyle Day, which is tomorrow.
Good evening, everyone, and it sounds like from the energy in this room that you had a marvelous day. I know I did. And I now have the distinct pleasure of recognizing an amazing woman for all the work that she has contributed to the city of Newburyport. I have a proclamation. Whereas the 2015 Newburyport Literary Festival is pleased to honor Jean Doyle as this year's recipient of the Newburyport Literary Festival Award. And whereas Mrs. Doyle, a lifelong resident of Newburyport, graduated from Newburyport High School in 1947. Mrs. Doyle was married just after World War II, and as a stay-at-home mom, she and her husband raised 7 children. As her children grew, Mrs. Doyle decided to continue her education. And in 1969, she graduated summa cum laude from Merrimack College with a bachelor's degree in history. And whereas in 1972, Jean went on to earn her master's degree in history at the University of New Hampshire. Returning to Newburyport High School, Mrs. Doyle taught history and international relations and was responsible for implementing the highly successful community service program, which allowed hundreds of students to get to know and contribute to the Newburyport community. Jean spent 30 years at Newburyport High School until her retirement in 1999. And whereas Mrs. Doyle is the author of Life in Newburyport, 1900 to 1950, and Life in Newburyport, 1950 to 1985, which chronicles the memories, news events, and city affairs from interviews taken from residents who lived in Newburyport during those respective periods. And whereas an avid gardener, Jean Doyle, now lives in Newbury with her husband. Now therefore, I, Donna D. Holliday, as mayor of the city of Newburyport, speaking for all of its residents and guests, publicly honor Jean Doyle and declare Saturday, April 26th, Jean Doyle Day. Given under my hand and seal this 25th day of April in the year 2015, Donna D. Holliday, Mayor.
Thank you very much.
Someone has to be taking a picture here. Congratulations, Jean. Okay.
Thank you. Congratulations. Mwah. Well, we are going to turn the program over to Jean and her family, but Kate Bullock is with us this evening, and she was a student of Jean's and is going to introduce her. Like you haven't already met her, but she's just going to say a few words, so please welcome Kate Bullock.
So I am one of the many students who was fortunate enough to pass through Mrs. Foley's classroom, that's what I remember, Jean Doyle's classroom, 25 years ago. I wasn't a particularly talented student, unfortunately, but even so, I was able to recognize and appreciate how well she led by example, her palpable enthusiasm for her subject, and her desire to show us that history is not something that's stuck in the past, but that is constantly unfolding around us all the time before our very eyes, planted in me the seeds for my adult professional life, in which I am constantly trying to, turning to history to make sense of the present in the journalism that I write. But more important than what she did for any one individual student is what she has done for this town. To have an historian living in our midst, doing the hard, close work of recording who we are is a gift not every community is blessed with, and we are so lucky to have had her doing this work for us. So it is with great pleasure that I am introducing to you this year's Newburyport Literary Festival honoree, Jean Foley Doyle. Thanks. Thank you so much.
Is the water here?
Yeah, I have water right here, so just turn to me if you need it, or do you want it under here?
This is a story of how a lover of history, with no thought or desire of becoming an author, and no professional skills as far as publishing went, ended up writing and publishing 2 books on the history of Newburyport. It all started in 2003. During a meeting of the Board of Directors of the Historical Society, I looked around at the other members and what I could possibly contribute to this group. I knew little about architecture, antique furniture, samplers, or paintings, as did the other members of the group. But my 30 years of teaching history at NHS steered me in that direction. I realized that Newburyport's early years were already covered. What we needed was a history of the 20th century. From the beginning, my emphasis was on people, those who lived in simple houses and worked in the factories, as well as the well-to-do who lived on High Street and were so influential in the early years. I suggested that we begin by forming a committee to do the research. A professional would write the book. Each member could choose a topic, or several topics, if they so chose. I decided to do a chronological study of the period, which made my job that much more difficult. It required an immense amount of research. utilizing the facilities of the Historical Society, the archives at the Public Library, the Custom House, records at City Hall, newspapers that were available on microfilm, and many other sources. In the process, I found several CDs compiled by a local resident, Ron Irving, that contained over 20,000, and I mean 1,000, pages of material. None of this had ever been opened. It is now available in the archives of the Public Library. After 3 years, it became apparent that the committee was not working as well as I had hoped. Everyone got along well, but opinions differed as to what should be included. Despite our efforts, we had been unable to find a professional to do the writing, and it was apparent that we already had too much material for one book. Meanwhile, my own work on the chronology that had required years of research was finished. I had already given 3 years of my life to the project and felt at the rate we were going, I would not live long enough to see my work published. After much thought and without consulting anyone, I decided that since the chronology could stand on its own, I would publish that section myself. The committee could concentrate on completing the topics and publish that separately. This would solve the problem of too much material and satisfy those in the group who wanted to take a different approach. Now I was on my own. The publisher gave me an estimate of $23,000 to publish 1,000 copies. I had no guarantee that I could sell enough copies to meet my expenses. This type of book would have a very limited audience. Since I live on a teacher's pension, I was taking a big risk. Despite this, I informed my children that I was spending their inheritance. And with no knowledge of how the process worked, I took the plunge and signed the contract. Luckily, Jennifer Karen, who had already authored and edited several works, agreed to sign on as editor. She proved to be indispensable. At this point, I was so naive as to think that my job was almost finished. Little did I know about publishing. My work had just begun. I had made a list of pictures that should be included. Now I had to find out not only what was available in the public domain, but solicit photos from private individuals as well. My daughter-in-law, Rosemary, a skilled photographer, prepared the digital files for me. We settled on the best 150 photos. It was quite a learning experience for me and far more complex than I had ever dreamed it would be. Once the book was ready for publication, I began to concentrate on a marketing strategy. Since I lacked experience and couldn't afford an agent, I just went ahead and did what I thought it would work. It occurred to me that the list of people who subscribed to the Newburyport High School alumni newsletter might be helpful. Their bulletin went all over the country, following those residents who had left Newburyport. It turned out to be the most effective marketing tool that I utilized. In addition, I racked my brain for the names of people who might be interested. By then, I had about 2,000 names on my list. I did a mass mailing in April. In my letter, I offered a $5 discount from what would be the bookstore price of $40 and set a deadline for payment. I had a stroke of luck when I was asked to speak to a group whose scheduled speaker could not come. I was hesitant because I had very little experience with public speaking and felt very unsure of myself when on the stage. Teaching in a classroom is different from speaking to an audience, but somehow I made it through. One engagement led to another, and people became acquainted with my book. Meanwhile, the orders and checks started pouring in from all over the country, along with telephone calls from people wanting to share their Newburyport experiences with me. The 1,100 books arrived in mid-September. That was something else I didn't know. The printer has a right to do a 10% over printing, and you have to pay for those books. So there's that much more to pay for. By that time, I had 550 prepaid orders. We mailed and delivered these orders first, and then sent copies to the bookstores. Much to my relief and amazement, all the books sold out before Christmas. I had made my expenses with a little to spare, and so I ordered a second printing. At this point, I'd like to ask Jennifer to tell us what it was like to guide a neophyte like me through this process.
Thank you, Jean. And I know you don't consider yourself a writer, but as a college professor once said to me, a writer is someone who writes. So you are a writer, and we are most grateful. So what is the role of an editor? It's not just about the Oxford comma and split infinitives. It's about taking the author's vision and making it highly consumable. Jean's vision was to tell the stories, the memories of the people and the town they love, going way beyond the facts and figures. We had hundreds of pages to work with. I still remember very clearly after I'd spoken with Jean on the phone and agreed to accept the project, her coming up to the house, this vibrant, tiny woman carrying the most enormous binder I have ever seen. Do you remember the original binder that we were working with? We spent hours poring over these binders. We went through way too many printer cartridges printing out the manuscript. I was collecting coupons for Staples constantly. We had so many great and spirited team of contributors, great writers and observers and storytellers. If you think of it as a patchwork quilt, it stretched for miles and miles. But we needed to take that quilt and make it a tapestry suitable for hanging. So we had to be fearless and not let the task overwhelm us. And as an editor, I had to get out one of our most important tools, the chainsaw. It was like a wedding. We couldn't invite everybody. We couldn't have 2,000 people to the wedding. So we couldn't include every special story that we had in front of us, or the book would have been 2,000 pages long. So I was like the driver's ed instructor, putting my foot on the extra brake, letting Jean know when we needed to stop and sometimes back up. Jean was thoughtful and passionate about what absolutely had to be included. And in the end, we had a very special volume of all the things that happen within those facts and figures, the joys, tears, memories of the people that shaped this town at several pivotal moments in Newburyport's 20th century history. I especially loved learning about the immigrants that arrived in the early years and how much they contributed to our culture and society. And it was such a pleasure to work with Jean over the course of the year as we became great friends, and I will forever treasure the experience with you. Google and Wikipedia can only tell you so much, but books, the reason why we are gathered together this weekend, will live on and on. And we are so grateful to Jean for capturing our 20th century lives in a book. But let me bring her back up to the podium because her journey continues.
As I struggled in the final months, I vowed repeatedly never to do it again. There is an old adage, however, that says, there is no fool like an old fool. And it was not long before I started on book 2. Luckily, Jennifer agreed once more to guide me, and my friends and family continued to support me. In some ways, it was easier because I had learned so much. But on the other hand, it was more difficult in that there was so much more material to cover, especially when it came to the restoration of Newburyport. That is why I stopped in 1985, before the book became too heavy to carry. One of the best sources for the books was the project my students and I worked on in 1995, when we interviewed over 100 people and later published these interviews in a series of pamphlets. Many of these stories are in the books we later published. People sometimes ask why I put both of my married names on the covers. It was my first husband, Everett Foley, who supported me when I wanted to go to college after having 7 children and was already in my late 30s. Later, as a teacher, I was able to share my love of history with hundreds of students. After his death, I married Joseph Doyle, and he was the one who bore the brunt of this endeavor. Knowing how much this meant to me, he was very patient and put up with my many hours at the computer. He was very proud of Book 1, but unfortunately died before Book 2 was finished. I felt it only right to put both names on the covers because both had played a major part in my accomplishment. Thanks to Facebook, I was able to include stories in the book from people who responded to my posts asking for anecdotes and remembrances of Newburyport. Many of these replies came from a younger generation, many from people who had moved far away from Newburyport. One theme ran through their stories, a feeling of nostalgia and a wish that someday they could return to Newburyport. As with all endeavors, there were some problems. Having finished my research and finalized my pictures, I left for a 2-week vacation on an adventure cruise in Greece with my daughter Masha while the index was being compiled. It was a gift from a family member for my 80th birthday. Unfortunately, after only 4 days away, I suffered a broken neck that would require months of hospitalization. One day, my daughter Masha arrived at the hospital with bundles of materials for me to proofread. I was devastated. There was no way I could do the 3 sets of proofs required. I couldn't even read the first page. A book like this with so much data would require hours of concentration. No problem, Masha said. I'll do it. And that's how the project was completed. The fact that I have lived here for all 85 years gave me an advantage in that I knew so many of the people involved. What is even more important is the uniqueness of Newburyport. So often its historical sites and architectural heritage are cited. Equally important, however, is the character of the people and their willingness to help, whether it is in a field such as research or in many matters relating to the betterment of the community. No one ever said no when I asked for an interview or memorabilia. I do not consider myself a writer per se, but rather a recorder of life in Newburyport in the 20th century. Someday, a more accomplished writer will paint the big picture. To do this, however, requires the factual details of what transpired, and I hope these books will be of use to future historians. For tonight's program, we have prepared a short slideshow that illustrates how some of the people we interviewed dealt with the problems and opportunities of modern life. Our first reader is my daughter, Masha Foley.
The Great Depression, the difficult years. We're going to go through and read a series of anecdotes from the oral histories that ended up in the book or the pamphlets. The Great Depression. Everybody had to work, and I don't say that just for me. I say that for anyone my age now that lived through this. We were happy and we were poor, but we were never hungry. Everybody was in the same boat. Nobody had more than anyone else. Nobody had less. We would shovel snow for the railroads in the winter. I used to shovel from Eagle Street to halfway down Kent Street for around 25 cents, and I was lucky to get it. Sometimes we would get a milk bottle that was worth a nickel for doing an errand, and we were thrilled to death. Things were cheaper. Penny candy was penny candy. My mother ran a little grocery store on Kent Street, and we were very involved in that. She worked 7 days a week. My mother brought up 4 children without a husband. He had died at 39. We were never unhappy. If someone had a half a loaf of bread more than someone else, they would share it with the ones that didn't have any. And that, I think, was a good experience to go through. From Mike Taranda. Knuckers was a standing joke of anyone my age or older. That was during the Depression days, and let's just say you were poor. Your father didn't have a job, your mother didn't have a job, but you still had to get something to eat. Well, where the Chinese restaurant is now on Pleasant Street, there was an alleyway. You'd go up there and get government food. The man who ran it was Nucka, Iowa. That was his name, Nucka. You'd go up there and he'd give you food, always grapefruit, plenty of dried beans, salt pork, and flour. Your mother would bake bread. You could always get something to eat from Nucka. Nucka also gave out clothes, a jacket or a sweater. The only thing was, you would get to school on Monday morning with your nice new sweater on, and someone else would have the same sweater on. They had one style sweater, but two colors. That's how you knew who was getting the free clothes from Nucka, Iowa. From Isobel Champoux. We had a flush toilet, but we didn't have hot water. We didn't have a furnace. What you did at night was you put hot bricks in the bed, you would heat the bricks up until they were hot, and then wrap them in a towel and take them to bed with you. That would get your feet warm. The bedrooms were always so cold. I'd say 95% of the people our age did that. You wore your stockings to bed, and big, thick blankets. We had a wood stove in the living room, and that would heat the kitchen. And her husband, Donald Champoux, reflecting on Bossy Gillis. Bossy Gillis was a crude politician, but he probably did more for the poor people of Newburyport than anyone else. He did more for people by giving them jobs. He was a typical ward politician who was boisterous and helped put Newburyport on the map. They knew Bossy all over the country. If you came from Newburyport, people would say, "Ah, that's Bossy Gillis's town." I used to sell his newspaper, The Liberator. The only reason everyone bought it was to see if their name was in it. He used to tell juicy stories about everyone. Judy Kennedy, who worked at Newburyport High School for many years, reflected on Devil's Den. Devil's Den, that's where the silver mines were years ago. Not very rich silver mines, but they were silver mines. They were out on Scotland Road, just off of that hill. You could see where they were. But only boys were allowed to take their bikes and ride to Devil's Den. That's right, no girls. My mother said, girls don't do that. And girls did not go down to Bummer's Rock either to thumb out to Plum Island. That's the big rock right at the corner of Water Street and Ocean Avenue. My brother took me down to Bummer's Rock one day because he didn't want to spend his money. It cost 7 cents to ride on the bus to Plum Island. So he put me in front of Bummer's Rock, and I stuck my thumb out while he hid behind the rock. I was about 5. When the car stopped, the guy driving the car knew our family. Everyone knew who you were back then. You had the face of your family. And my father gave my brother a strapping for making me bum to Plum Island so he could save his money. World War II brought new roles for women in Newburyport, and here's a reflection from Margaret Cary. I got stuck in the cook's job at Fowles on State Street. The cook was called up to serve. The most memorable experience I had was when they delivered a whole steer, and I was supposed to cut it up. I said, I don't even know where to cut. So the cook took out a purple indelible pencil and he drew lines. Then I ended up standing in the sink sawing this big steer. I said I never took this job to do this work, but it was kind of funny. Junior Lawler was my dishwasher, and he eventually became the mayor. I worked as a cook in the daytime, and then at night, I studied with the National Training Act to become a machinist. I was one of the first 3 women machinists at Toll. We worked on radar, and that was where I got my nickname. They called me Radar, and it was fun. I had a little jeweler's blade, and I made the knobs that turned the radar machine. Some parts were made in Connecticut, some in Rhode Island, and some here in Newburyport. Then they were all assembled in another location, so nobody would know how to complete the radar design. We gold-plated everything here at Toll to get rid of the contaminants. I was a third-class machine operator when I left there, and I had served enough time to be called a machinist. But I also had to sign a form saying that if a man came back from the service, I would give my job back to him. Our next reader is Jean's daughter-in-law, Rosemary, who was so instrumental in the hundreds of photos in both books 1 and 2.
This anecdote is from Norman Doyle. He says, school dances were held at City Hall instead of the new high school. We still call this the new high school, and that's how you can tell people's age. Nobody had cars. If you were taking a girl to the dance, you went to her house and walked her to the dance. You were lucky if you had a quarter so you could go down to the Mal Spa afterwards. It was a big trip. A chocolate walnut sundae cost 15 cents. So we'd plan all night to steer the girls not to use the whole quarter. Once in a while, they would fool you, and you'd have to say, well, I'm not hungry. So all those kinds of things were tough, but they were funny too. As I indicated, everybody was in the same boat. I can remember that Billy Greer's was the only kid in the high school with a car, parked in the parking lot. He was the rich kid. Obviously, we all tried to get a ride, but he couldn't take the whole school. Next one is from Teel. And she says, I remember Spofford Street. That's where I lived. Every winter, we used to slide down Spofford Street. Our sleds would go down Spofford Street and right over the chain bridge. Can you imagine what would happen if a kid went down Spofford Street today and tried to go over the bridge? He'd be meatloaf by the time he got there. Back then, there weren't that many cars. So that was a great thing to do after school in the winter. Also, we used to go down Ashland Street. That's quite a lot steeper. Back in those days, there was a man by the name of John Mack, and he had a one-horse plow that he used to go around plowing the sidewalks. Bob Fuller's remembrance. I remember once during the 30s, we lived on Plum Island. If you lived on Plum Island, even in the 1970s to the 1980s, you were either eccentric or awfully poor. You were probably crazy. The summer was nice. The basin was not mud. It was beautiful golden sand. When winter came, you could look through the cracks in the floor and see the sand below because the houses were set on piles. The big thing to do was try to keep a cup of water from freezing during the night so you could prime the pump in the morning. There was no electricity, so we didn't have electric pumps. We had outhouses and kerosene lamps. Eleanor Witcomb. For some reason, the architects wouldn't let Bossy Gillis go into the new high school. He was mayor at the time, and he wanted to open it up. So he got a fire engine out there and climbed up the ladder and went in the library window. Another time, he held up the teacher's pay, and one of the teachers went down to his filling station. And after he filled her car with gas, she said, "Until you pay me, I can't pay you," and drove off. From Virginia Glynn. This is about the fire. The fire of 1934. It was on a Friday night. I think it was May 29th. It was warm, and fire alarms had been ringing all over the city. First it was down the south end, then it was down the north end. They were all false alarms. There were 4 or 5 of them. They kept firemen going, and finally, the last one was on the corner where the highway goes over the bridge. Right there on the corner was the Dodge Brothers shoe factory. That was a building they set on fire. And they know it was set because when they found it, the building was burning from bottom to top. When the fire alarm went off on the corner of Titcomb Street, I knew it was our box. I opened my eyes and looked. There were burning embers coming down beside the window. I jumped up and said, "Oh my God, we've got to get out of here." I grabbed my son, who was asleep, and a quilt my mother made when I got married, grabbed it off the bed, wrapped my son up in it, and ran down the stairs. The police were banging on the door saying, "Get out, everybody get out." I was running across the street when a fellow I knew came running across and grabbed my son out of my arms. He was taking us down to his house on Prospect Street. But my family, my husband, my mother-in-law, and father-in-law, They still stood on the corner. They had to see the house catch fire before they could leave. Embers were falling all around us, and I was screaming my head off. They couldn't hear me because the fire alarms were going off. I was running behind the fellow with my son, and my family stood there. They had to see it catch fire because they wouldn't believe it would burn down. It did burn down. When they finally knew it would burn, they left. But I was running after my friend with my son. We went up through the town on one of the buildings there was a fire. I thought the whole city was going to go. My friend took me down to Prospect Street and into his house. They pulled the curtains down so I couldn't see anything. He went back uptown to tell my husband where I was. The fire burned all night long. The next morning was terrible. It was awful. We had nothing. We lost everything. We had no insurance. It was so depressing. We had a cat and chickens down below our apartment, but they were gone too. My son never said a word. He never cried all through it. Where the fire was, there was nothing left but ashes. They said they had help as far away as from Boston. There were people up in the north end of the city who slept through it, never knowing what was going on. They found embers as far away as Newbury Green. Everyone helped out, and people around the city gave us furniture and clothing. After that, every time a fire alarm came on, I panicked. Even now, I don't like to hear the alarm. And the next person to read us some anecdotes is my nephew and Jean's grandson, Brendan Foley.
William Dickie, a native of Newburyport, was stationed on the USS West Virginia on December 7, 1941, when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. Dickie kept a diary all through the war that he shared with my grandmother when she and her high school students were collecting memories for the high school history project in 1995. Following are the excerpts from Dickie's diary. Breakfast was over, and I had washed my dishes, but I had not taken them to the galley. The word was passed, away and rescue party. I started to go up the ladder when the general alarm went off, and they announced, "General quarters, man your battle stations." And the bugler started playing general quarters. Just at that same time, I felt the ship shake. By now, I had turned and was running forward down the starboard side to get to my battle station. We took another torpedo hit, and the explosion threw me against the starboard bulkhead. The next thing I was conscious of, I was hanging on the I-beam with one hand and crossing myself like the Catholics do with my other hand. We immediately took another torpedo hit, and I believe we started to flood with fuel oil. I went up through the manhole in the hatch onto the main deck and started to run for the overhang of number 2 turret. I was running alongside of George Reed, a ship fitter. A bomb hit on the centerline gun of the USS Tennessee. The shrapnel from the bomb hit Reed in the small of his back. A corpsman took care of Reed, and I later learned that he had died 3 days later. I stopped long enough to take off my shoes, the same ones issued to me in boot camp. As I went forward to the bow of the ship, noticed the USS Oklahoma had capsized, and the USS Maryland was putting up anti-aircraft fire. When I got all the way forward, I met Stu Jackson, whose brother had worked in the lighting shop with me. Stu was crying because the torpedo had gotten into the steering engine room, and that was his brother's station. The water aft of us was all on fire as the USS Arizona had exploded and blown up. Everyone was diving headfirst over the side as we expected the ship to capsize. At that time, a cartoon that was printed in the Boy Scout handbook came to mind: never dive into unknown waters. I jumped into the water, feet first, over the side. I swam through heavy oil in front of the USS Tennessee to Ford Island. The following are the reflections from Leonard Buddy Knox. Leonard Knox was the assistant superintendent of schools in Newburyport and took advantage of the GI Bill. When the war was over, the GI Bill gave me the opportunity to go to college. When I came home, I had been out of school for 4 or 5 years. I had pressure from my wife-to-be, who thought I should go back to school and try to get an education. I went to prep school for 1 year and reviewed my math and science. Then I was accepted at Tufts University and spent 4 years there. I wouldn't have been able to go to college if it wasn't for the GI Bill. They paid my tuition, and they gave me a monthly allotment to live on. It wasn't much, but it was enough to eat and survive. The GI Bill is really what put me through school. The following are reflections from Vin Clancy. The end of World War II brought many changes. Cars were now available, and money was easier to come by. Vin Clancy had fond memories of that period. A big thing was dancing in those days, ballroom dancing. At the casino over in Hampton Beach, all the name bands were there. You know, Benny Goodman and Tony Pastor were there every summer, but all these big names were there for one night. Then, during the week, there was a fellow from Manchester, Ted Herdick, who used to have an orchestra over there. It was a good dancing orchestra, but in order to get in, you had to wear a shirt and tie and a sport coat. The girls had to wear a dress and nylons. There was no drinking in there. You could smoke, but you couldn't drink. All of Hampton was dry. There was absolutely no liquor at Hampton Beach, which was good. We went in groups, 4 or 5 couples going, in 2 cars or whatever to go dancing on Saturday nights. That was a big thing for us to do.
I'd like to conclude the slideshow with a few memories of what took place in the 60s and 70s, a very important time in the history of Newburyport. Urban renewal had initially called for the demolition of much of downtown Newburyport. As a result of the work of dedicated citizens, however, Newburyport was allowed to restore rather than demolish many historic buildings. These slides show how Newburyport looked before and after the restoration. Okay. At the same time, all eyes around the nation became involved with the oncoming celebration of the 1976 Bicentennial. The Bicentennial was particularly important to Newburyport because so many events in the early years of the American Revolution took place close to home. Civic organizations, school, churches, businesses, and everyday citizens went out of their way to celebrate the occasion with parades, pageants, local history programs, and reenactments. It was a golden age for local history. During Yankee homecoming in 1975, the Old South Church presented a pageant reenacting the May 8, 1775 formation of the 1st Volunteer Army of the Revolutionary War. It took place in the aisles of the Old South Church. Fred Bell read Reverend Parsons' stirring speech as he called men to arms. One of the most popular reenactments was that of Benedict Arnold's 1775 expedition to conquer Quebec. That, of course, was before he became a traitor. This map on the slide shows the route they took to Quebec. After leaving Boston, the small boat stopped in Newburyport. A marker in Newbury tells how they spent a night sleeping on the Newbury Green. In the reenactment, the boats that stopped in Newburyport were greeted with enthusiasm, and the leaders were invited that evening to the Embarkation Ball. This slide shows Dr. Plouff and his wife, Annette, leaving in their costumes for the festivities. There was a big parade the next day, starting at the 3 roads, that went down Green Street to the landing where the boats would leave for Maine, stopping at the towns listed on the map. Many Newburyporters, including my husband and I, followed the progress of the expedition, and when they neared Quebec, we all rode to meet them and joined the celebration. On June 24th, 1976, Newburyport celebrated its 125th anniversary at a party at City Hall. The city issued what it termed a public invitation to all residents at no charge so that the people could see the renovated City Hall auditorium. Highlighting the event was the insertion of articles into and closure of the time capsule. It will be opened at the 250th anniversary in 2026. Close to 500 people, many dressed in gowns and tuxedos, attended the Mayor's Ball on June 26. A grand march led by Byron Matthews and his wife, Helen, kicked off the event, followed by former mayors Lawler and Zabriskie and descendants of mayors of the past. And this shows you George Lawler on the left with his wife, Byron Matthews with his, and to the far right, Al Zabriskie with his wife. It was an exciting time for all of us. In closing, I would like to describe a scene from my past that still evokes remembrance. I was a senior in high school in the autumn of 1946, the night the memorial to Flash Zabriskie was dedicated at the relatively new stadium. I sat in the stands with my friends watching the ceremony. The war was over only a year before, and we were still emotionally affected with the loss of the 37 men and women from Newburyport who died in World War II. My boyfriend, Everett Foley, who later became my husband, had just returned from the Pacific. He, along with several other veterans, stood at attention beside the memorial. The lights in the stadium were dimmed as taps played. I shall never forget that scene. Time passes. Memorials become overgrown. New wars and economic crises engage the interest of the people. So it has always been. It is our hope, however, that these stories we have recorded will serve to keep these memories alive so that they will never truly be forgotten. And I want to thank all the people throughout the years who played a role in this endeavor. It is our gift to the city of Newburyport. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was amazing. Before we close, I would just like to acknowledge one last time that this is our 10-year anniversary. Now, earlier tonight, I listed a whole lot of people who put this together, but there's one name that I did not say, and that's the person who took this from an idea to a reality, Vicki Hendrickson. Yes. I have a couple of people backstage here who, and here she is. I have a few people here who would just like to say a few words. The first is Hillary Klein from the office of Senator O'Connor Ives. Hillary? Haley. Did I say the word Haley?
Yeah,
Haley Klein. Let me say that again.
Hillary is a good word.
Only Vicki, you can say that. So, Vicki, it is my absolute honor, on behalf of State Senator Kathleen O'Connor Ives, to present you and the festival, on the occasion of your 10th year, a Senate citation.
Oh, wow.
And it reads, in recognition of your dedication to celebrating the rich literary heritage of the greater Newburyport area, and for your 10-year anniversary celebration, signed by the Senate President, State Senator Kathleen O'Connor Ives, and the Clerk of the Senate.
Wow. Well, thank you. What a lovely, that's beautiful. Isn't that nice? That's lovely. Thank you.
And there's one more. This is for you, the fearless leader of the Literary Festival.
Oh, well, thank you.
And it says, in recognition of your hard work and dedication in establishing the Newburyport Literary Festival, which celebrates literature, authors, and readers of the greater Newburyport area and beyond. Congratulations.
Oh, thank you, Haley. Tell the ball he's not the governor anymore.
Don't get me in trouble.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
All right,
Not so fast.
we have two more special friends of the festival,
Oy vey.
Andre Debus and Rena Espaillat.
Yes, that's right. Two of my favorites.
I have a few words to say about Vicky. This is called A Sort of Ode to Vicky. Why honor Vicky? Let me tell you. And my description's sure to sell you on all she is and all she does and why we love her. It's because Vicky was born to make things happen. Her synapses are always snapping with new ideas and projects bold to spice up life for young and old. So she sets up exciting classes to feed the brains of lads and lasses with science, art, and history. Her energy's a mystery. She loves to change the status quo. She tells us all, let's go, learn something new, think something rash. Of course, these hijinks call for cash. Vicky's a whiz at coaxing money. She calls on prospects and says, honey, all Southern belle and dripping charm, honey, I'm here to twist your arm. What can you do for us this year? Our annual festival draws near. Dozens of authors hither wending to read and speak, and tourists spending at restaurants and shops downtown. We wouldn't want to let them down, now would we? And then, yes, you've guessed it, her strategy is true and tested. Those she approaches soon come through. There's nothing Vicky cannot do. She paints, she writes, she cooks so hearty that every meal becomes a party at which sometimes it comes to pass that fireworks ignite the grass. Dear Vicky, with our love and praise, pretend I have a glass to raise as I conclude this doggerel. This wish, may you live long, be well, and do precisely what you like, and life be good to you and Dyke.
Oh, thank you. Oh, that's wonderful. Lovely.
And that is my proclamation for you.
Lucky that I married a man that rhymed with life.
See?
Yeah. Uh-oh.
I will be brief, darling.
Yeah.
In here is a bottle of wicked good bourbon. This is a legendary story, but if you're new to this festival, I have to repeat this briefly. This festival is in existence because Vicki Hendrickson read a National Endowments of the Arts study that showed that a majority of even college-educated adult Americans were not reading anymore. Very little, fiction and nonfiction. And she said, somebody must do something about that. And I think about all the times I and probably you and our loved ones go through a week and see and hear things that sadden us and enrage us, and we just keep on keeping on, and we don't do anything. I don't do anything.
Oh,
But she did something.
Glenny.
No, but she did something. You know, I used to not like the word author. I thought it sounded kind of snooty, and then I looked it up. And I really like the word now. Do you know what author means? An author is the originator or beginner of something. So I would like to present this wicked good bottle of bourbon in this cool bag to the most important author this festival has ever had. Love you.
Love you too. Well, I'm totally surprised. I mean, I'm not totally surprised right now because people started coming into the back area, and I thought, what are these people doing here? We didn't invite them back here. What are they doing? They should be up front. But anyway, I'm very touched, and I'm very grateful to the city of Newburyport because you can plan all you want to. You can have the best people come and be surrounded by all kinds of folks, but if you don't have a city or a receptive audience, then it just falls on deaf ears. So thank you, everybody, for supporting this for all these years. Here's to the next 10. We'll see you next year, the 29th and 30th. Okay, thank you.